Okay, this is Fan Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with it's actually got the wrong name of banner here, but let me get that down for you. Here we go. The old grandmother's tree.com is your
Yes, it is.
URL, right?
That is correct. That's right.
And you're a celebrated author and storyteller behind the old grandmother's tree, and you're going to talk about writing insights, and you have a podcast as well, right?
I don't host a podcast. I have been on many different podcasts, some in Canada and
Oh,
here in the United States as well.
you've just been a guest on podcasts.
Yes.
So one of the questions we ask every guest on the show before we get to the heart of your story is why do you do what you do, and what motivates you?
I think what a reason why I've created Old Grandmother's Tree above all else was to honor my ancestors and their heritage and to share that story. And I think also it motivates me, especially now, is to build a bridge between French Canadians in the United States and our cousins in Canada, in Quebec in particular. And I think that's important, especially now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, given what's going on with the state of
Hmm.
the world,
Yes.
it's important to understand heritage. I think people lose sight of the oral histories or folk tales. I'm part
Mhm.
Cherokee and Blackfoot, and there's a lot of oral history with the
Sure.
indigenous tribes of
Sure.
America. So I can understand people wanting to keep in touch with traditional ancestry. Is because it's who you're that you want to understand who you are, right? You want to know what your background is. So people always like to go forward, but sometimes it's good to go back and look at like what did my ancestors go through? What are the
Mm.
core elements of my culture?
Oh, absolutely. And for me, that has been a life part of my life since I was a small child. Um, on my mother's side, we were French Canadian, so I knew from ever since I was a boy that our family came from Quebec, and we'd often visit Quebec. And I was always fascinated with the stories from my grandparents and my great aunts and uncles about Quebec. And I would always ask, well, who was your grandparents? And who was their grandparents? And of course, back in those days, in the 60s and the 70s, and in those days, we didn't really have the tools that we have right now to discover our ancestry, to really have a
Yeah,
depth. But I've always wanted to know. So when those tools finally came up, became available, for example, like Ancestry and DNA tests, I dived right into that because I wanted to know. I wanted to reach back and
or
rediscover their stories. And my philosophy on that is I look at it as my story, my life story is a continuation, direct continuation of the stories of my ancestors. So, although I know my part of the story, I don't know the beginning of my story. And so it was a great adventure to discover that. And one of the things that I did initially about maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, is I gave my mother and her siblings a DNA test. And growing up, we always were told by mom's family that, well, we're 100% French. Well, the DNA test actually showed that we were not.
yeah,
We were mostly French, but we also had a little bit of Spanish, or specifically Basque, a little bit of English, and most surprisingly, was Native American. It showed up in the DNA test, but I didn't know who they were.
well, you
So,
didn't know which tribe from what area.
no, no, I did not. In fact, it took 2 years of research to find, and I found four gateway, I call gateway Native American ancestors,
Mm,
and two were Micmac women, and I
mhm.
really don't know very much about them, sadly. Another one was a Penobscot named Matakawando. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was primarily in Maine. His daughter married a French baron named Baron St. Castine. And if you ever Google up Matakawanda, you find him and his son-in-law actually had, really interesting adventures in Maine. But it was the fourth ancestor we discovered that actually really touched my heart in a special way. And it was an Algonquin woman that she was born as Mitiogoku. And she lived in the second half of the 17th century up in Trois-Rivières in Quebec. And interesting enough, her life was really fairly well documented by the Jesuits up in Quebec. So we knew, who she was married to, when she was baptized, when she died. And a real fascinating story began to emerge from this research. I didn't do the research, but someone else did, named Norman Lavallee, who was also a descendant of Mitiogoku. And she had a fascinating story. And it began for me when I was researching it in 1652. She was married to another Algonquin named Assababish. She was about 22 years old. She had two small children. And the Mohawks came up from New York, raided Trois-Rivières, and her husband was killed in the raid, and her two small children were taken in that raid, and she never saw them again or even knew what happened to them.
Wow.
And so here she is, 22 years old. She loses everything, but she didn't, fall into despair or give up. And 5 years later, she married a French settler named Pierre Cauque. And together, they became my ninth great-grandparents. And one of the things that really touched me especially was that when she died, the priest in Trois-Rivières wrote this, I think is probably one of the most beautiful and most, short but effective eulogies I ever read about a person. So anyway, the priest wrote this about her right after she died. He was making a note in his log, and he said, I quote, "Mitiogoku lived a full life with dignity, respect, and love, a courageous and loving Algonquin woman." Now, when you think about all the power in those two lines, for someone to say, wouldn't we all want someone to say at the end of our life that we lived a full life with dignity, respect, love, and courage? And so it was really unusual for a man in the 17th century to write that about a woman, much less an indigenous woman. So she had to be very remarkable.
Yeah, I mean that right there kind of opens up a whole story that you could kind of imagine. That level of respect is not something that's common based on the history I know.
No, it's not. It's not. And so she had this respect in her community. So what does that mean? I mean, there was a whole story behind those two lines that we don't really know, but it's strongly implied. She was very active. She probably was very much involved in the community around her. She was courage. She had dignity and respect. And I think that's really important for a woman to be described that way in that time period. And she went from 22 years old, losing everything. And then when she died at the age of 68, a priest wrote that about her, saying that she lived a life of dignity, respect, love, and courage.
That must have really affected, like, the community she was in.
Yes.
Looked up to her despite the fact that typically indigenous people and women wouldn't be granted that level of respect.
No. And so I took that and I said, I'm going to tell her story. Now, it's not uncommon for authors, authors to write like historical fiction of their ancestors. And there's a lot of research that goes into that. And they try to write a historical fiction based on the facts that they know of their ancestors' life, and they try to tell it accurate way. Well, I did something a little different. I took my Quebecois, French Canadian ancestors in that time period, as well as what I knew about Mitiogoku, and I retold their story in a reimagined old Quebec with magic, folklore elements, and Native American trickster animal characters that they interact with.
Oh, like spirit animals, like spirit animal type characters?
Yes, very much. But they're although they have Native American names, I chose names from the Micmac background, also Abenaki, as well as Algonquin. The characters in the book, though, have their own personalities, and they're not dimensional characters. In other words, they don't just appear, make something happen, and disappear. They
Mm.
all have very unique personalities and foibles and weaknesses. And I mean, they're all good characters, but they're tricksters in the sense that they like to stir the pot a little bit.
Oh wow! So
And
they get all
it's
more involved in being on and off.
right. So I had my ancestors interact with these Native American inspired trickster characters. And so I retold their story. And I don't I wouldn't describe it as I use the folklore storytelling style. Is
Hmm.
I think of folklore as a language, a universal language of all we all have in common throughout the world, because we all, whatever our background, where we came from, we all have mythology. Cultures have mythology and folk
Yeah,
tales that talk
yeah.
about the human experience. It's the way they express the human experience. So I see folklore as the language. That folklore
Glue,
style is the
the
language
glue,
I did to tell the story.
the glue puts it all together. Like, yeah, it's a
Yes.
common
Hmm.
theme, that you get. You get these Shakespearean themes or the King Arthur themes, or people want to reenact things out of the Bible or the Iliad, or you
Right.
know,
Very
they,
much.
they tend to retell it in that frame. Where you could
Hmm.
look at, like, a Norse guard frame. You could look at, like, Eritrean frame. You could look at all
Hmm.
different types of frames you could come up with. But if you come up with something that maybe is like this unique, you know, indigenous, Native American, North American
Hmm.
experience, and then yeah, that's
Right.
interesting. You're coming from a different, maybe a little kind of microcosm of
Right.
a
It,
macrocosm.
and the other thing that makes Old Grandmother's Tree different was it's not just a text story. It's very much a illustrated
Oh,
story
illustrated
as
like
well.
picture book, like a picture book kind of thing.
Well,
Or
it's not a graphic novel, but there's
mhm.
almost one illustration per page. So I have a 2 volume set, and within the
So
2 volumes, there's about 600 pages, 40,000 words, 10 stories of various lengths. Some are pretty long, some are fairly short, um, and over 450 full color illustrations,
kind of like a
which
grim fairy tale. They would have a picture.
yeah, I think so. I mean, it was more than. I mean, perhaps you've seen other stories, like Graham Phillip. For example, a fairy tale, Grimm's fairy tale. You would see one illustration at the beginning of the story, maybe
Yeah,
another one, but this one is very dense with illustrations,
that's
and
cool.
so I was really blessed to work with 2 artists in creating this book, because that's what it takes. It took 2 artists to actually
It's a
make it.
collaboration between two different artists. Are they working together, or they do different? Is
No,
they kind
they work with me, but they don't work together directly.
of,
It's kind of interesting. So um, the process I went through in writing the story was I wrote the text, and I would then work with the storyboard artist, and she's a wonderful artist. Her name is Masami Kyono. She's based out of Manhattan, and she is a storyboard artist down there. And she, in fact, does storyboards for commercials. And I think a couple of years
films.
ago, yeah, films. Yeah, she did. She just recently she's going out to LA for a premiere of one of the films that she worked on, and she had the Doritos commercial from like a couple of years ago in the Super Bowl. She actually did the
You
storyboard for
storyboard
that.
for that. Oh, that's cool.
Yes, yes. So her job is, so she would work with me, and we talk through it chapter by chapter, and we kind of map out and talk about those illustrations. And I kind of give general guidance, and we share ideas. She create these rough sketches, and she's like the person who goes into the wilderness and cuts down all the trees, help build that dirt road, so to speak, through
Yeah,
the
yeah.
wilderness. So she does it. She maps that all out, and then when that is done, I turn to the next artist, who's another very gifted talented young woman. Her name is Natasha Pelly-Smith, and she is based out of Toronto, Canada. And she is also of Ojibwe and Cree ancestry. So she was very much, touched by some of the Native American elements in the story itself. But she's the one who would take those rough sketches and she would develop these full color, three-dimensional, beautifully illustrated designs.
So it's like the storyboard's kind of penciling it out, and then
Yes.
the final illustrator is actually coloring and inking and getting it more formed out.
That's right. But Natasha would also add her own creativity to the design, so they would change a little bit, and she would add her own creativity and touches to it. So, and you had to do it that way for a project this size, for 450 illustrations. Each one was meticulously designed, and I think that if Natasha had to do the storyboarding, brainstorming with me, I think it would just wear her out. Mm-hmm. It was extremely time intensive for both of us to do this, but so that's why we had to use two artists for a project this size, and the result is just beautiful. I've had people look at it and they'll say, I could see this being an animated series, and
that's the thing.
Yes.
What's interesting is, like, I've been a big comic book fan my whole life. Mm-hmm. And I was always interested in, like, Jack Kirby and Joe Sinnott,
Yes.
And Kirby would do these amazing pencils, and Joe Sinnott kind of made it pop. And then, there's a colorist and there's inkers. In the comic book industry, there's multiple artists that would work on a project.
Yes.
And so they would do that kind of general layout. And Kirby was so fast, he would do like 5 books a month.
Oh, yeah.
He's doing like 4, so he had the ability to do that much content, but he couldn't ink it all. So he'd have multiple inkers inking it, and multiple colorists and letterers and other people doing it. So I'm kind of familiar with having multiple artists work on something, at least in that kind of space of manga, anime, comic books, Western.
Yeah, it's it's interesting you talk about like graphic novel, and that has a very interesting, very set style. This book is almost a graphic. I would call it a hybrid.
Hybrid of a novel.
Yeah, it's almost a graphic novel because there's an illustration almost in every page, but there's a lot of text. And one of the reasons why I did that was early on made the decision. He looked at Natasha's illustrations, and they're just beautiful, and I'm like, I'm not going to spoil it with a thought bubble, on top, blasted on top of it. So we said, well, let's put the text below or to the side on the page next door if we have a full page illustration. So that's how we kind of developed this, because I wanted Natasha's illustrations to, really stand on their own, and they do. You could look at those illustrations, you could almost figure out the whole story without the text.
Just from that. Well, that's what the last time Mark does that. Like, I was talking to an illustrator that was a Taiwanese illustrator, and they had a picture book that didn't have a lot of words. We were talking about like the nonverbal nature of illustration and how illustration in itself can tell the story. And she very minimal amount of text in her work. And it's interesting that I'm talking to another like creator that's in this kind of space. It wasn't quite a graphic novel. It wasn't quite a picture book.
That's absolutely right.
Seems like there's a cool space for these type of projects that you're into. It's the second person I've interviewed in this space.
Yes. Cool. Yes, and there is some stories in there that we did kind of as an experiment. There was a story called The Dance of Creation Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 is in Volume 1. Part 2 is in Volume 2. And initially, they're like 4 pages of full illustration, no text. So you look at this, it's about the creation of the world. And it's really stunning, beautifully. But for this third book, I'm working on other books too. So I've got 3 other books in this series in various stages of development. So initially, our concept was we're going to continue on this concept of without text and call it Dance of Creation Part 3, which is continuing the story about how the trickster animals came into being, how the world was created. But we said, no, we're going to put these all together add more illustrations, and we decided to add text to tell a story. And but I made it a little different. This book that's going to be coming out in August called The Dance of Creation. So I'm going to have this one large story based on the first two small stories that were in the first two volumes called The Dance of Creation. But it's going to be a prequel and a sequel to Old Grandmother's Tree.
Oh, so you're trying to tie it together. It's like a continuation.
Yes, well, it'll show the origin of the trickster characters, where they come from, and that's very much a typical motif in mythology. Where did the gods come from? Where did these trickster and what's their origin story?
Origin
Yeah,
stories, yeah, that's the
so
big
this
thing.
tells their story, and but it's a sequel in the sense that I set a framing story, because every story, especially mythology, is an oral art initially.
Yeah.
And so the framing story is it's a campfire, and there's an Algonquin grandfather telling the story around the campfire to his grandchildren about the creation of the world. But I set it 100 years in the future in Pembroke, Ontario. So
wow.
It's a sequel. And he, in the story at the end, he says, he talks about Mitio Goku, who in the stories are called old grandmother. She's the old grandmother. So he says, I'm her grandson, and so aren't you, he tells his grandchildren. But I liked doing that, set it ahead and behind, because I want, in this next story, because I want the reader to feel immersed in the entire environment. It's not, I'm not telling a story in the past, but it's all around you. It's some of it still unfolding, even as you're reading the book.
Yeah, I think the sequence is like how you can go, when I talk to filmmakers, a lot of times they play with time sequencing. And authors lately, I've been talking to a lot of authors that will play. Because once you create like a concept, I can backfill, or I can future fill. So I can take this character and take it a generation ahead. I can go to the previous generation, or I can have different phases that aren't sequential at all. It kind of have hints of like the future, hints of the past, and play with the timeline.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that we did in this series is that within the 10 stories in the 2 volumes is you can start anywhere you want. Every story is written in a way that it can stand on its own.
Stand alone.
Now, yes, it can stand alone, and you can enjoy it just by itself. And now the stories do refer to other events that have happened in the book and other stories. So, but you can still enjoy it. And no matter where you read it or where you start, as you read all the stories, a bigger story or a larger story will emerge like a mosaic with a little piece of glass you put on the wall. Every story is like that. And then a larger story is going to emerge as you read the book. But you can read it any order you want.
Yeah, so you can go in and dive, or you could take the step away and get the 30,000-foot view and actually see this is a bigger. There's Easter eggs that bring me here and there. But if you want to just pick up like a standalone piece of it, you could pull it out, but it could have an Easter egg that maybe you didn't recognize until you read more.
Yes.
And you start to see it open up.
And we do. We do have some Easter eggs there. Some are very obvious. Some are a little bit more subtle, but they are in the illustrations that they will. In fact, if you have to get the whole story, you have to look at the illustrations carefully, because there are elements in the story that are told only in the illustrations. And one thing that, as far as like being referenced to each other in the, I'll share this one vignette. In the first 2 stories, we have a marriage between Pierre Calc and Mitio Goku. We have a ghost appearing. The spirit of Mitio Goku's first husband appears to her on her wedding night. And we also have a little element of time travel, where Mitio Goku's grandfather gets pulled ahead unknowingly by the trickster animals to 1903 by accident. But he's only there for a few minutes. But he sees, in the first story it's describing, and it's illustrated, he sees his descendant in 1903 in the distance in the wood. And he feels that connection but he doesn't understand what's going on.
Mm.
And then in the second volume, you see the same scene, except you see it from that young woman who was grandfather Charles looking at. So you see it from the other point of view.
From perspective. That's interesting.
Yes. So it's like one of the ways we tie it, the stories kind of become referential to each other.
Well, I think I love things that pull you in like that. And also it's cool that you have the standalone, because like the attention span of modern readers is sometimes they like, are they going to go and get pulled in and stay in? Or are they going to pick around, and deal with what they have? Some people are so distracted today. I'm a child of the 70s. So I would go, read, Wrinkle in Time, and then read the whole Time Quartet. It's like, oh, there's a whole time. So I'm going to go to the library and get them all and read them all. When people today all I read is Wrinkle in Time, and I only read part of it.
Yes. Yeah. And it's that's what I think the effect is if you read these stories. You'll read it, and you're not going to get all the answers about all the characters. You're going to be left with some questions. Well, those questions will be answered in another story. So just pick one and start reading it, and you'll get a little bit more of the whole story as it comes to life. And
so the trickster animals I'm really interested in, did you actually base them on like real people in your life, or did you do it more on the mythology level?
Well, I think I would say they're based on Native American mythology in the sense that I used common animals in North America, like a moose, bear, raven, fox, a turtle. I gave them Native American names, but their personalities are very unique, and their roles within their group, and they're a family. They're very much, they interact with each other as a family. Mm-hmm. And there's one part of the story where I did put a little, I would say that during the trickster animal characters is, if you read carefully, that's where my voice, I think, comes through the most, is through those characters. I think so. There's one scene in particular in the second volume where Poku the moose is carrying his uncle, Mikish, the turtle, who's very, very old and very wise, but sometimes he feels a little insecure. And he's walking back to Mount Orford in Quebec. They're going home after a day's adventure with the people in Quebec. Misadventures, really. So anyway, Poku's carrying his uncle back, and they're having a talk. And Uncle Mikish is feeling like, I really messed up out there in that village. I couldn't knock the lumberjack off the log. I couldn't throw the axe in the axe throwing contest. You must be really disappointed with me. And his nephew, Poku the moose, is saying, oh, no, you're a turtle. You're not supposed to be able to knock somebody off a log or throw an axe. And then Mikish he's still frustrated. He wants some kind of validation. So he says, well, nephew, you must always be tired of me repeating my stories. And his nephew, Poku the moose, says, oh no, I love all your stories. With every retelling, I learn something new. And so that goes back and forth. And finally, Mikish, he gets frustrated and he says, nephew, will you allow an old being like me the dignity of self-pity? and Poku says, no, I will not. And he says, Uncle, I don't care that you couldn't throw the axe or knock LaRue the lumberjack off the log. I love your stories. Everything that's good about myself, I learned from you. And to me, you are the best uncle ever. And I love you. And that's the affirmation Mikish was looking for. Now, I share that chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters because I am both characters in this point in my life. I have older aunts and uncles who are in their 80s now, my mom's siblings. And so I know what that's like to kind of look back and be an older person and interact and wonder, don't you get tired of hanging around with me? I'm just an old person. No, we're not. But on the other hand, I'm sometimes Uncle Mikish because I have nephews and nieces in their late 20s and their early 30s. And so sometimes I'm Uncle Mikish. So in that chapter, more than any other chapter in the book, I'm both characters having a conversation with myself through them. And it's very much about that family relation, about, listening to our elders and respecting our elders.
That's always interesting that you bring it into the kind of common theme of like people can it's like a folk tale. It's got these kind of mystical elements, but you're bringing it, grounding it in the relationships that everybody can understand, and they can kind of get like, oh, I know that uncle that does that. I know my grandpa that does this. My aunt
Right.
does
Right.
that. Yeah, that seems familiar. So
It
people can.
is. It is. Yeah. And two other characters are based on myself and my brother. One is Mewan the bear and Azaban the raccoon. And they're always getting into trouble. And one of the things they like to do is steal food from the people, the villagers. And there's a whole sequence where they hide in a closet during a pie baking contest in 1903 Quebec. When everybody leaves, they jump out of the closet, they eat the pies, and then realize we need to bake more pies. And of course, it's a total disaster because they don't know what they're doing. And their older sister, Wokwi the fox, is exasperated with them, and she tries to help them, but she's not much better than they are, and they come up with this horrible mess. And I base that on myself with my brother when we used to get into trouble and mischief. And so those two characters very much talk about that childhood mischievousness between siblings and supporting each other and getting in trouble in a fun way, getting in
Yeah.
trouble together.
But do these folk tales all have kind of like a lesson to be learned, or in some way?
Oh yes. Oh, very much, very much. But I don't hit you about the head with it. So
Mhm,
it's not like this is the lesson for today. And when you read the
mhm.
stories, I think the lessons and the spirituality of the stories, and they kind of allow them to speak for themselves.
Mm.
So you'll read it and you go, oh, I kind of identify with that, or I really, maybe I should, reach out to my uncle or my aunt, old one. And maybe I should be more patient with them when they retell their old stories about the olden days, because they're not going to be there forever. So there are lessons learned. Every story has a unique lesson, but you have to kind of draw that out yourself as the reader.
Now, would you, or do you have this as an audiobook, but because of the not amount of illustrations, would you not do it as an audiobook, or does it exist as an audiobook?
I think it does not exist as an audiobook. I think that would be very difficult to do without the illustrations. It'd be like trying to breathe with only one lung.
Yeah, 'cause you
You
have to
you
describe
need
each
both
illustration.
lungs,
Yeah.
both parts of story. The illustrations and the text are blended together and work together to tell the story. And without the other, you'll definitely would feel that something is missing. So unfortunately, you can't do it that way as a pure audio book. But I do think the way it's designed with the text and the illustrations work together very well, and the illustrations are also of a high quality nature, it would make a very good like animated series, for
Yeah,
example.
it seems like it would lend itself to animation. Like
Absolutely.
I spent a lot of time, like I said, in Japan, and the anime
Hmm.
manga kind of universe, very, very familiar with like spirit animals. So
Yes. Yes.
animators would like, like if you think about Tezuka and Tatsunoko, some of the Japanese animation,
Hmm.
they always had these concepts of like spirit animals in them, and in that space, like that type of form would seem to work really well with like a Japanese animation company could probably take the idea, but a Disney level company could do it too. But
Oh yes. Oh
there's
yes.
many
It's
different
ready.
ways you could approach it.
Yeah, it's I would say it's very turnkey. It's ready to go. I've got the illustrations right there. The texts are right there. There's enough illustrations that you can just fill in the gap, and voila, you'll have a great series. But it's not done yet. Like I said, I do have three other books. I have Dance of Creation coming out this summer. Next summer, I'm planning on having a book called All Around You There Is a Light, which will deal with Mitio Goku at the end of her life, retelling the key aspects of her life, especially the attack that happened.
Mm,
She's retelling those story to her granddaughter before she dies, and
wow.
so that it's going to be quite a story. We're working. Masami is actually doing the storyboarding for that story right now, and I've done some initial sketches, not visual sketches, but kind of story initial. Started writing the story for another book after that, probably coming out in 2027, but I don't have a title for that one yet. But so the book is still ongoing as an ongoing process.
Have you taken this out into the world, into the book convention or the comic convention spaces? Because it seems like to me this book could work at a comic convention because the amount of art that's in it.
Oh, I think so. I think so. I have not yet. The book really has not been out that long. Volume one came out in August. Volume two came out in October. And in November, I released French language versions of this book as well. And so I'm just getting started with it. I do have it available in some libraries here in New England. I gave a presentation at a French Canadian museum in Rhode Island recently last month, and I'll be doing my first book selling event at a local library nearby. So I'm just getting started in that process. But what you suggest is actually a very good idea, I think, also.
Yeah, because I think the people were in that space, like the fantasy con, comic book cons. Because I remember I found a property called Mouse Guard, and
Mm,
Mouse Guard is kind of highly illustrated, kind of got written, text with illustrations, and it was that author he had it, the creator had it at comic conventions in Boston, and I was like, wow, this is not. It's really more of a picture book, but it was kind of a hybrid
mhm,
of a picture book and a graphic novel, and it kind of reminds me like, well, this seems like it could really fit in that space. And there are people, and I actually was a big fan of it. I bought like all the volumes of that, and
mm,
I think there's a
mhm,
lot of people that are looking for new independent ideas outside of the big houses, like the Marvel house, the DC house, the Image house.
mhm,
People are looking at the independent creators and things that come out of different spaces. Like back in the day, like Mouse came out of a
mm,
different space. So sometimes the smaller publishers like Dark Horses and other presses that independent press are willing to push other ideas that aren't from the
mhm.
big publishers.
That's a good suggestion. It's a good suggestion. I'm going to look into that because I I I think one of the challenges of this book, as far as marketing for me, at least initially I'm discovering, is that this book is so hard to categorize.
Yeah, it's kind of
Um,
a hybrid, but I think a lot of people would love it. Like I feel it already. I'm thinking of get it on my. Well, I'm going to get it on my list.
oh, you should get it because I know you'll like it. I would say most people don't understand what I'm talking about at first. I remember early on, I was showing a bookseller the draft of the cover of the book. I said, "Hey, look at this. What do you think of this cover I have?" And she goes, "Well, what is it about?" And I said, "Well, it's a retelling of my Quebec and Native American ancestors in the 17th and early 20th century Quebec in a magic folklore world." And she looked at me and I think she was just totally like, "I don't get it.
But that's the kind
I
of
don't
don't
get
get that you want.
how do I?"
That's
She's thinking, "How do I categorize that?" She can't.
well, it depends. Like this fantasy, to me, it fits in a fantasy
Right.
realm. Like that, as a comic book fan, it fits to me because I've seen things like I said, like Mouse Guard
Mhm.
and Mouse.
Yes.
I've seen people do these graphic novels that will be from these independent publishers, so from San Francisco to the people in the things coming from the EU, where people would do these stories that are not normal comic book stories. They would take on serious stories, or folklore or different ideas. And I
Mhm.
think that type of audience is looking for new ideas. They're looking for that kind of space in the fantasy world that it's believable and it's something that we look for. Like I look for back in the day, like Cerebus, the aardvark from Dave Sim, the
Mhm.
independent comic book guy. That drew everybody into the independent industry and why people buying that because it was something different. It was like this 300-page epic thing about this aardvark that had this magical stuff going on, and it was in this kind of weird world. and you're like, wow, like the ideas in this space where people are willing to entertain them.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. I think I remember that feeling. I think what you're describing is something I felt when I discovered Castle Waiting. Um, that series, because it was so different. How do you figure it out? What is it? Is it, it looks realistic. You have people and castles, but you have talking animals that are characters. So how does that all work? Well, it's different, but it's engaging.
yeah,
And this series it's very original. And so I think is even though it's hard to categorize, what I have discovered though, fortunately, and is that anyone who gets the book and picks it up and reads it, looks at it, loves the book
they get drawn
because
in.
they get
Yeah.
drawn in. So,
Well, that's the thing is like, original ideas are kind of rare because everybody
mhm,
in the art world, people, lately today because of tech, algorithms that kind of rule everything. Everybody wants the algorithm only knows what it likes, and what it likes is something that's been done.
right.
And so I've been the kind of person I like to go and find the cutting edge. In my childhood, the '70s, I was college radio, independent comic books, uh,
Mhm.
looking for things that were off the beaten path. Going to finding the people that weren't in the top 10, probably the bottom 500.
Right.
It's like
Right.
I was always looking for the new and emerging art,
Mhm.
and that's where to me the cool stuff happens. Because that's where the cool ideas come out. You get a guy like Bone, like Jeff Smith and Bone,
Mhm.
like that was like, oh, how could that happen? And it did because he had this vision. People come up with these ideas, and it is like a Disney level vision coming outside
Right.
of Disney. And it wasn't anything Disney had done before. It was brand new. Um, so I think that there's a space for that, and I think there's a lot of young people that want that because they've seen all this stuff that's getting repeated on repeat all the time.
Mhm.
So that's why I like to have the show to show people there's other things out there. There's
Yes.
there's people
Yes.
that are creating things that are worthwhile that you should check out.
Yes, yes. I no, I a lot of time went into make this book. And one of the things that I was determined in part as the creative process, Natasha and I, was that we were going to put as much time and money into this project to make sure on the other end that this was a high quality project. And that required, I worked with a writing coach and reviewers who gave me advice about the text and good feedback. I had editor services that I paid for that actually did, corrected all the grammar, make sure that was right.
Mhm.
We, Natasha and I, sometimes we went after she did this beautiful illustration. We realized, it's not going to work, and so we would redo it and do a whole nother illustration. And that would take hours, and that was
Yeah,
just one out of 450. So there's a high level of attention that was
craft.
played to
Yeah,
crafting this. Because I do believe that was one thing I said. I can't control. It's very difficult to get the word out about a good product, but especially because today, the world is just very crowded. But one thing I could control was the quality. I figured if I have a good product, if we
mhm,
have a good book and a good concept, and it's quality, and people realize right away when they pick it up that this is a quality product, then the book will start speaking for itself.
well, it's
And it
like the
just
law of attraction that you put it out there, you'll find a tribe. You know, like
Yes.
you put the work in, and if you got the your frequency vibration, but like you put something where you put so much love and effort into it. I believe the way the world is today, it's crowded, but there is this like ether of the net,
Hmm.
and you put the word out, and people will find it. People will it'll appeal to them, and this whole podcast is about getting the
Hmm.
word out. Is like getting the word out and letting creative people know there's a space to talk about your project, and
Hmm.
you had the drive and vision to do it. So now let's put it out in the world and let's see if people pick up on it. Because I think that's to me, art is the thing that gets me up in the morning. You
Hmm.
know, like the idea that people are creating new things. That's my drive is like to hear those new things, to see those new things, to actually embrace it and help people understand. Like, it's not just like what you see on the CNN. The other thing that's going on is there's work in the world, is art, and that's
Right.
why we want to get up and get excited, because there's new things to experience, and like what you're doing with old grandmother's tree, you know.
Very much, very much. And I have a great love and appreciation for art. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. Um, but I'm a very visual person. Even when I write the stories, before I put any words down, I see the stories unfold in my mind like a movie.
Yeah,
I
it's a movie
see it, and
cinematic.
then
Yeah.
and so then I just describe what I see. So it's not so I don't do outlines. I don't do this long range plan. It just comes to me all at once. Sometimes I'm laying in bed at night, tossing and turning, and the story will just come to me all at once, and I'll see
It's
it
like a
unfold.
muse, right? Like you channel the muse, like the whole idea, like, you know, like
Yes,
Victorians that talk about the muse and being
yes,
inspired by that. And like, you know, I feel artists, we can channel. Like if you're a writer, you're channeling visual information through the written page. Every written page triggers like a picture in people's mind. When they read a book,
mm,
they're almost building a movie in their head.
right,
You
right,
know, like
right,
as a musician, I create a sound painting, and I want you to get pulled into that painting. And a lot of times it ends up, it could be a movie, and it's gonna trigger something that happened in your life, a feeling that I keyed on and you picked up on, but you own it. I wrote it, but you own your experience, right? Of how my art triggers that in your head. And that's
right.
the great thing about art. It's like you trigger that vision. You had your own interpretation, but once that the world gets it, they feel it, and however they're gonna feel it, you know. And
That's
that's
right, and that's part of it's part of the universality of the language, and why I love the art piece. That I could not imagine the story without the art, um,
hmm
because it is a universal language. And the other thing I kind of discovered about writing this, and Natasha will tell you the same thing as she kind of created these stories, is that there's a the creative process is for inside a human being is very fascinating when you watch it within yourself, because there's a part of it that goes on at the subconscious level that I'm not even aware of, and
yeah,
it manifests itself where I'll put something in the story of detail that will become important later on in a way I didn't expect in another story. And Natasha would tell you the same thing. She would put details into a story in the way colors matched in a certain scene, and then it becomes important later on. So at a subconscious level, your brain is already making those connections
yeah.
and pointing out, but you're not aware of it.
95% of your things that you're doing are like on this subconscious level. And the cool thing is, like, when you're artist, like that gets put on the page, it gets put on the screen, it gets put on the canvas, and then you're like, then you go back and you look at it, it's like, oh wow, that's actually what's going on.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so we can actually see it, the result, or hear it, or, you know, we can touch it because we make it happen. Like as in being an artist, being in the arts, being a creator is like, that is like our wheelhouse. Is we're tapped into that external and internal. A lot of it is
Mm,
subconscious, and when you like kind of allow it to happen, when you give yourself like the permission for it to happen, um, then a lot of that stuff is like it kind of writes itself. It
yes.
creates itself because like you're like it's there, and you're
Hmm.
bringing it into the world.
Yeah, there. I sometimes I will after I write like a first draft, and usually the first draft I'll just do all at once on these short stories, or at least most of it, because it comes all at once. And later on, I'll look at it and says, "Wow, where did I come up with this?" Yeah, because it's that imagination part is something that's just so within your subconscious. And you talk about external inspiration, the muses. There are times um, that I would feel that my ancestors, like Mitio Goku, was inspiring me to portray
Mhm.
her in a way that she wanted to be portrayed. I can't explain why that is or how that works or what the truth is behind that, but I would say that it did feel that way sometimes. And Natasha also felt sometimes that her ancestors, especially her native ancestors, were speaking to her and
Mhm.
wanted her to do this project and really much influenced her as well.
I think that's a common theme when I talk to a lot of creatives, and they feel as like they're pulling like their ancestors, they're pulling the influences, like they all these things that are in your subconscious, or they are channeling from the other side. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of that, that is, if you don't restrict it, if you don't disbelieve it, right? If you don't get super logical, like, left brain, right brain, if you can stop it from coming over if you don't
Absolutely.
kind of let it happen. And some people, like, they block it off, and other people, artists is like they seem to not be able to turn the faucet off, like a Dylan, constantly writing,
Mm-hmm.
like, Hendrix when he was at his top, 3 years, they still finding stuff. It's like people, they would let that flow come in. And one thing about Hendrix, there was one thing that I remember, there was a story, he was playing with the Isley brothers on one of their records, and he suddenly brought in one of his own compositions and asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, the universe gave it to me and I couldn't stop, so
Mm-hmm.
put it down."
Right. Very
It's
much.
just, that kind of tells you, like, he was so in tune that he kind of knew that. He would talk in those terms. He had to, like, get it down because it was getting transmitted, and he had to pull it, and he felt it, and he's like, "Wow, that's a good example of an artist kind of describing that muse influence."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely feel that way. I would definitely feel that way. Um, yeah, there's something else I want to share about connections. So also is that this book has already made connections unexpected ways. And one example is that when this book was finally done, or I was almost done with it, I had like a almost ready for publish. I sent an early draft to the Algonquin community up in Pembroke, Ontario, and
Mhm.
because Mitio Goku came from the Algonquin community, and in fact, she has some of her descendants, her and Pierre Count's descendants, actually lived there. So I wanted to reach out to them and I just said, hey, tell me what you think. And it turns out they loved the book.
That's
They
awesome.
loved it, and they really appreciate it. And that's one of the reasons why the next book is going to be set in, the storyteller is going to be living in Pembroke, Ontario, as an Algonquin, as my tribute to them. But I developed a great friendship with them, and one of my goals for the next book, Dance of Creation, is I would love to have it translated into the Algonquin language, which is an endangered language.
Yeah, that'll be
And
cool.
yes, yeah. So I'm looking figuring out how to do that. It's rather expensive. I think it's like $4 a word. So,
Wow, that's
but
expensive.
I do believe that there is a way. It's just a matter of me finding that way. Whether
Find
it's
a
a
way to get it
grant.
funded. Yeah, maybe you get
Yeah.
a grant from somebody.
Hmm.
Yeah, because really grant opportunities. My daughter's a artist, and she's does a lot of gets a lot of grant work,
Hmm.
as an artist, because she has a certain motif that she's going in and doing things with a certain aspect. Yeah, but that like, you can find, if you want to get things to happen, you can do your research. You can find people who are actually very supportive. She's actually getting some some people to fund her work. Uh,
Hmm.
patrons, patronage in arts is kind of a big thing.
Oh
So
yes, yes.
sometimes you get people like, oh, you get somebody likes what you're doing, and then they support it.
Well, I think it would be a wonderful way for me to take the next level is to honor my Algonquin ancestors, is to support the preservation of the language that they spoke.
Oh yeah, so that's a really cool way to do it.
Mhm.
You get people in a modern era to like connect to something um, that they can touch and read, and then actually understand that that connects to that. Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's a
So,
cool
so that's one
concept.
of my goals. I like to dream big,
Well, yeah,
and
you should dream as big as you can until somebody
yes,
tells you you can't do it, and then you still try to do
hmm
it.
yes, I'm still going to try to do it. So somehow I am going. I do believe that it will happen. I honestly believe it will happen. I just don't know how yet. But that certainly is one of my goals. Um, I think that we lose something not just Algonquin language, but any language, any ancient language that disappears when
Yeah.
the last speaker dies off. I think that we lose something, all of us, whether it doesn't matter if you were the speaker of that language or not. Collectively, as a human race, we lose something when an old ancient language dies,
Yeah.
and so I see this as someone who does have this bit of Algonquin heritage. So this is something I'd want to do in honor of my ancestors and to help preserve that language because I think it's a good thing to do. And
Yeah.
it's
Being in technology, one thing I always say is like, well, you take a tool like an AI, and if you have AI do stuff like that, well, that's a real good use instead of like
Mhm.
stealing people's copyrights. It's like,
Yes.
why don't you have it do something that actually would add value to the culture? Why don't you actually have it looking to saving endangered languages and actually go through the language? It
Yeah.
is that's what it works on language. And so if you actually could go and preserve languages or and actually come up and document it and try to save it, you
Mhm.
know, the efforts with that type of research to me is valuable. That could be useful.
Yes, absolutely. And so that is also one of my goals for the next book. I don't think it may be too much of a reach to try to translate all the whole series, at least right now. But if I can get that one book
Yeah.
done in Algonquin, I would consider that a gift for the community, for all of us who desire to preserve our heritage or other people's heritage, because all of it's important.
Yeah, whether it's being an anthropologist or I think it's super important. People are starting in this age to understand the cultures that were maybe just kind of wiped out without thinking that
Mhm.
that how important that is for our overall human history to not to learn from the past. And if you just make a decision to like wipe out past because it doesn't fit your paradigm, you're making mistakes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not just a communication system is lost when a language dies, but it's a way of thinking.
Yeah,
It's
the
a way
thinking
of
is what's
visualizing the world.
yeah, that's really important for human history to understand all the different ways that human beings think and cultural aspects that you want to try to, you know, preserve that. They spend tons of time trying to bring back dire wolf. Well, make sure you
Mhm.
don't lose a language.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. So,
but but I want to thank you for being on the Family Electric Ghost podcast. We have the old grandmother's tree or .com. It's like that's how people can actually order the book and get the book directly from there.
well, they it's available on Amazon.
Oh, and so you go
So
there.
so there is, but if you go to the Old Grandmother's Tree website, there's a week character Wikipedia. There's a biography of myself and Natasha. There's a few sample illustrations you can see. Um, there's a blog, but there's also a link for every book um, that take you direct to Amazon, so you can order either
Order right there.
volume in English or in French because it is available in French as well.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you and look forward to it. Hope you get on the road on a book tour and I see you on more podcast and you get this
Hmm.
out in the world. And if you want to come back for the other volumes, anytime you have a volume release, you feel free to, engage on our calendar and set us up for another talk.
Oh, I'd love to do that when the next book comes out. I had a lot of fun tonight.
Thank you. Have a great night and look forward to talk to you in the future.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Thank
All
you.
right. Gary, goodbye.